Hello friends, my name is Damian Wyld and I'm from the Australian Family Coalition. My friends at Full Gospel Business Australia have asked me to give you some talks and provide some thoughts and some insights into issues affecting the family. Now, firstly, just to mention AFC, for whom I work, we have more than 50,000 supporters across every Australian state and territory, and not a few friends overseas as well. So wherever you're tuning in from, be it Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia or beyond, we certainly have friends close to you and we welcome many more friends. In terms of issues affecting the family, challenges confronting the family today, where do I start? Really, it is going to be very difficult to do this topic justice in such a short period of time, but we do have several episodes to try and wade through some of these issues. And there are a number of ways we can explore them, these issues affecting the family. I say the family in a couple of ways also. Firstly, the family as an ideal, as an institution. Basically, the bedrock unit of our society is the family, based on marriage. But then, of course, putting aside the ideal of the family, the practical reality for families, including yours and mine, as we negotiate some of the challenges of the modern world. And I acknowledge that some of these issues will vary from country to country, depending on your own local cultural and political norms, the role of faith in our societies today as well. My own organisation has the challenge of trying to present these sorts of issues to a very secular and sometimes very hostile world when it comes to an understanding of Christian perspectives of life and family, much less trying to arrive at a situation where the family can flourish as we'd like to see it. Let's talk briefly about the family from a Christian perspective. We know from Genesis the origin of man and woman, their relationship with one another, the command to go forth and multiply. To a Christian, these are not radical ideas, these are deeply ingrained ideas. We read in Scripture, we understand from our own faith backgrounds. But they are increasingly divorced from reality for many secular listeners who hear what they believe now to be an outmoded, outdated, and rather quaint idea of what marriage and family should be, even if they believe that marriage and family have any role at all in our modern world. Many people believe marriage to be an outdated institution, something that could be consigned quite easily to the dustbin of history. Ironically, at the same time as many people are seeking to expand the definition of marriage, but that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. Then, of course, there is a natural or purely biological understanding of family. And this is not something that necessarily has its origins in an understanding of faith, but, of course, as any Christian would know, is completely in sync with a faith-based understanding of family. Creation is not something divorced from the Christian idea of reality. We know that even without an understanding from a faith perspective, the idea that husbands matter, wives matter, parents matter to their children, these are not some modern constructs, they're not some social constructs. These are things quite deeply rooted in biological reality. They are rooted in millennia of human history. It's quite interesting, therefore, to see the challenges that confront this very reason-based and very rational understanding of what the family is from both a Christian and a natural perspective. G.K. Chesterton, that famous Christian man of letters, writing some 100 years ago in the United Kingdom, talked about a triangle of truisms: mother, father and children. He said you could redefine it, you could muck around with it, but do so at your peril. That reality remains regardless of what we might try to do to the family. But be that as it may, there are many issues and challenges confronting the family today. You know that, and I know that. Let's try and look at some of them, perhaps both external and internal, as we might categorise them. Looking at some of the external threats today, and again, as I acknowledged earlier, these will vary from country to country, but there are what I would call legislative threats to the family, and there are cultural threats to the family. So the legislative ones first. Let's look at the beginning of life. Abortion today is freely available through much of the world. In some of the more liberal Western societies like Australia and New Zealand, they've recently seen, after some 50 years of legalised abortion, whether through the court process or through a parliamentary process, a sudden rush towards a wholesale abortion to birth, no holds barred rules, essentially removing abortion from being an exemption to the criminal code. That is, it's not permissible to take a life except in the case of abortion. We have now seen even those criteria removed from laws, and essentially, for the most part, no rationale, no reason required, abortion available up till birth. Now, obviously, quite aside from the incredible impact this has on the life of the unborn and to the health and well-being of any mother who goes through that process, because regardless of what people pretend to think, abortion trauma is a huge plague affecting our society. But putting all of that aside, looking back to the family as an ideal again for a moment, the diminishing of the value of human life, the tarnishing of the dignity of human life, is a very tragic process that we are still seeing unfold before our very eyes at the moment. And that lends itself to many other threats facing life and family today. It's no surprise that some decades after we see life diminished at the very beginnings of life, from conception and in the womb, which should be the safest place on earth, we now see a huge momentum behind euthanasia and assisted suicide laws. Now, people may term these whatever they wish. They may like to dress them up as voluntary assisted dying or some other fancy term. But these laws essentially boil down to one of two things: either a person seeking to end their own life, or having someone to help them do it. For a Christian, these would be suicide and murder, respectively. Let's not sugarcoat it. We are not talking about the turning off of a machine. We're not talking about the end of burdensome treatment, unnecessarily prolonging life. No Christian wishes to see someone unduly or unnecessarily suffer. That goes without saying. But we are seeing laws aimed at the deliberate taking of a life. The severe, again, diminishing of the value of human life in this regard is extraordinary. And we see this at the same time as many of our leaders are concerned with the huge impact on mental health in our times, the need for suicide prevention programs. Likewise, the enormous growth in the number of elder abuse cases, not always necessarily physical, but sometimes emotional, sometimes issues of neglect, financial abuse, and so on. Is this a society that people would wish to see the rollout of euthanasia and assisted suicide into? It beggars belief. Likewise, marriage, as essentially the linchpin of the family. As I mentioned before, marriage is that basic unit of society. But the linchpin within it, the foundation of the foundation, is marriage, based on one man and one woman. Again, both a Christian faith-based understanding, but also biological reality. It takes a man and a woman to have a child. The diminution of marriage is not something new. We've seen that take place over decades, whether it be the liberalising of divorce laws, particularly in Western countries, the advent of no-fault divorce laws in the 1970s, the legislation of de facto relationships into marriage-like laws across different jurisdictions from the 1970s onwards, which incidentally were often done with the best of reasons, trying to promote stability for any children born into those relationships. But again, changing the understanding of marriage and removing it from its relatively elevated position in society, through to the more recent phenomenon we've seen predominantly in Western countries, but now even within Asia in places like Taiwan, where people in same-sex relationships have sought to enjoy some of those same benefits. Now, on the surface of it, one can understand why, in the same way de facto relationships received legal protections in the 1970s, why some of these people might have some sort of claim over property, inheritance, superannuation and so on. But when it comes to marriage, this is a completely different kettle of fish. Marriage predates the state. It predates nation states. So whether the state chooses, as most do, to give some sort of legal recognition and definition to marriage in its laws, it has no place in redefining them. Why then seek to redefine it? Well, I think it goes beyond that desire, whether we agree or not, to, through the form of some legal recognition of a relationship, to provide those securities over property, superannuation and so on. It really goes to the heart of marriage and family, which is a topic we're talking about. And diminishing it further in that way, as we've seen, has led to all sorts of, I would say, unintended but perhaps intended consequences. We've seen a plague of issues, particularly in the West, but increasingly spreading to other countries, affecting sexual orientation and so-called gender identity within school classrooms, on our TVs, across what many of you would understand as the idea of the seven mountains, academia, the political life, entertainment and so on. These ideas seeping through all aspects of society. So that is another legislative threat as well to the Christian and natural understanding of family. There are many others I could tackle from a legislative perspective, but let's talk briefly about some cultural issues. You don't need me to tell you, if you're a parent, a grandparent, anybody really, that your family faces many challenges, whether it be through those seven mountains, as I mentioned before. You have to be increasingly vigilant of what your children are watching, not only on TV, but these days on the internet. The plague of pornography, which is also sweeping across the world. The issue of drugs and alcoholism. The issue of domestic and family violence and abuse. There are so many cultural threats to the family today. And the idea that Christians are somehow immune from this, isolated from this, is a fallacy and something to be very wary of. So that brings me to another really important point that I'd like to discuss with you. And that's the question of, well, we are aware of some of these threats, these internal and external threats to the family, but what do we do about it? This could warrant an entire episode or multiple in its own right, but I would like to at least just broach the topic with you now and explore a few ideas. The first of these is a very simple one for a Christian: prayer. Individual prayer and family prayer are obviously incredibly important. You don't need me to tell you that, but certainly reinforcing it never hurts, particularly the idea of family prayer. Now, for Christians, the merits of prayer are obvious and don't need to be stated. The idea of union with the divine life, the idea of grace, are obviously well known to us. But add to that, from a purely natural sense, I'm sure you're aware of the old adage, the family that prays together stays together. Now, while there's no absolutely rock-solid, ironclad guarantee of that, there's a lot that rings true in that adage. Studies have shown many times over that consistent, regular family prayer time is a huge factor in stability for intact families. The importance of fathers in that process in particular cannot be understated. Having an actively engaged father in family prayer life and the family practice of faith is incredibly important in promoting healthy, flourishing and intact families. And that takes me to the idea of re-promoting family life as an idea. Too often we see families distracted by screen time, mobile phones, tablets, and I'm not just pointing to young people here. Adults are often just as guilty. They may not be playing games, they may be reading the news, checking their emails, conducting business, but the inability to differentiate work time and family time has a debilitating effect on family life. The slow decline of the family meal around the dinner table, providing an important link between generations, is something that also needs to be arrested if we are to try and restore healthy, flourishing families. There is much that could be said about internal efforts to promote the family before we even look at the external needs. But in the time remaining to me, I would like to mention some outward-facing external things that I think we all need to do as well if we are to see a flourishing ideal of the family again. And that takes me to the idea of advocacy. I mentioned earlier on the concept of the 7 mountains. If you're not familiar with it, I certainly encourage you to go and do some research online. The idea of public advocacy in that regard, to lobby our parliamentarians, our decision makers, on important issues affecting life, marriage, the family, and not just the obvious ones I mentioned earlier, but even on economic questions. All of these things have a huge and often untold impact on the family unit. It may well be that you yourself are called to become involved in a party political sense. Christians should not shy away from that. The idea of render unto Caesar doesn't remove an obligation from the Christian to be involved in public life. And in fact, I would go so far as to say a good, sound and well-formed Christian voice is needed now in public life, perhaps more than ever before. I hope to share a few more thoughts with you in coming weeks in conjunction with our friends at Full Gospel Business Australia. But for now, if you've enjoyed what you've heard on this episode, I do encourage you to visit our website, the Australian Family Coalition. You can find us at austfamily.com.au. That's austfamily.com.au. If you click on the sign up option, we can send you our free regular newsletter, and we'd love to have you on board to partner with you and keep you informed on these and many other issues that we regularly engage with. So thank you very much for joining me for this short episode, and together we can work to ensure that the family, both our own families and the family as an idea in broader society, flourish. Thank you.